summer, I did a series on the 23rd Psalm for about 5 weeks, and in that process, I said that sheep were dumb, dirty, defenseless, dependent animals. And then last week, I preached a sermon on Jesus casting the demons into a herd of swine, and afterwards, Debbie Hager says, you know, Pastor Bob has picked on the sheep, he's picked on the pigs, and if he starts picking on the cows, he's in big trouble. So then on Monday, I got this this greeting card that you see up there on the screen from Craig and Becky Johnson. And if it says on the inside, and you open up, it says, "If you're happy and you know it, clamp your hands." So I guess it's a signal that I better lay off the animals for a little bit. And I invite you to open up in your Bibles to Mark, the 10th chapter, and the 35th through the 45th verses. You can find that on page 40. And invite you to kind of follow along. Just keep your finger in it, because I'll kind of just keep going through that as the sermon goes on. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Did you hear that? We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Can you imagine the gall to come up to Jesus and say to Jesus, "We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you"? I mean, they must have felt like they had a certain closeness, a certain pull with Jesus. You wouldn't ask that of just anybody. Every once in a while you have somebody say, "Can I ask you to do me a favor?" And, if it's somebody really close, if Julie asked me, "Would you do me something for me?" I'll just say yes. But yesterday I got a text from our son Tyler, and he says, would you do me a huge favor? You know what my response was? What is it? I wanted to know exactly what it is before I was going to commit to it. And, James and John come up to Jesus and they say, "We want you to do for us whatever we ask." And so Jesus gives a little bit of pushback, and he says, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" In other words, before I say yes, let me hear about it. And they say, "Well, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." They've been brainstorming probably as they're walking. There's a lot of time to be thinking as you're walking from town to town. And maybe James said to John, Jesus is setting up this new kingdom. And there's going to be places for everybody in this. But how about you and I get the best positions in this kingdom? And let's ask about that now, because if we don't, Peter will. And or some of the other disciples will ask for it. And so they call shotgun. Have you ever done that as a kid, or your kid said, "Shotgun"? They want to have the outside seat in the front. This was a big deal back when there was just like pickups with a bench seat up front and no air conditioning. You didn't want to be cramped in that middle seat, and you wanted to be able to sit on the outside where you could do this thing with your hand out the window, with the wind all the time. So James and John saw Jesus as a revolutionary. Jesus talked about starting the kingdom, and they want a piece of the action. They wanted to be given positions of power. Whether they had done anything to earn those positions, they wanted to get a piece of the action right on the ground floor. And of course, James and John didn't want to pay the price for this. So Jesus says to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" Now, these are two symbols, two words that had powerful meaning even back in the Old Testament. It's something that it just wasn't just words off the top of their mind. They're more than just figures of speech. He's telling them, and he's just told them what he's going to be facing. He's going to be facing suffering, mocking. They're going to spit him. They're going to kill him. The cup that Jesus drank and the baptism that Jesus was baptized with was his actual suffering, an offering of his life. And so his question to James and John are you willing to do this as well? And the baptism that Jesus was baptized with means, putting ourselves into conflict with evil and dangerous powers. I think of those young men who were honored this last week because they stood up and took down that man on the speeding train in France. They didn't stop and think, man, if we do this, we're going to get a lot of notoriety for doing this. They just thought, no, this is the thing that we need to do. Without taking any time to really think it through, John and James say, we're able. Then Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. Now, Jesus said that because he knew that one day James and John would be martyred for their faith, whether they knew it or not at this time. Jesus continues and says, but to sit at my right hand or at my left, it is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. When the 10 heard this, they began to get angry with James and John. In other words, they heard James and John shout out shotgun, and they're saying, no, shotgun, I claimed it first. I called it yesterday. I called it last week when we were just coming in, shotgun. And this attitude of trying to be first or having honor or prestige still haunts us. Who's the greatest? We want those seats of honor, whether we've earned them or not. So in response to their squabbling, he decides to use this as kind of a teaching opportunity. He pulls them aside and says, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it's not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Our society measures people in a variety of different ways. Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen has written a little book called How Will You Measure Your Life? And I'd recommend it to you. It's a good book. And he talks about how we measure our lives, maybe in athletics, like in baseball, what's your ERA, what's your batting averages, wins and losses. In business, it might be, how your sales are you moving up the corporate ladder. Sometimes we measure people by their net worth. Of course, this last week, that's been kind of a roller coaster for a lot of people. We measure people by the house that they have, the clothes that they wear, the car that they drive. But the parable of the talents that Jesus said, it's not about so much what you have, but how you use what you have and how much you give back. Sometimes people are measured by the power that they wield their ability and their right to control other people. Sometimes you can tell a lot of people about how they treat people who are in lesser positions than they are. I heard a minister telling this story about when he was just fresh out of seminary, he went to lunch with this minister of this large, prestigious church, and when they went to the restaurant, this one part of the restaurant was closed, and this minister said to the waitress, the hostess, said, I want to sit over there. She said, well, I'm sorry, that part's closed. He began to get agitated and angry and sort of belittled her, and it was throwing such a fit that finally she let him sit there just to kind of keep some peace there. You think about Lord Acton, the British historian, who said, all power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it can happen in almost any area of life. Forbes magazine ran an article that talked about how most of the most famous and successful CEOs, many of them were complete jerks and didn't treat people very well. But do you have to be that kind of boss to be successful? We obviously think of like Steve Jobs. Another one was John Henry Patterson, who was the CEO of NCR, National Cash Registers. He's the one who is credited with that term, "you're fired." You ever thought about where the term "you're fired" came from? He was one that if you were on the first floor, he would have and he didn't like what you were doing, he'd have your desk just moved out into the front yard. Or if you're on a upper floor, he'd have it thrown out the window, and then he would go out and he'd pour kerosene out over the desk and light it on fire. So that's where your fire comes from. He'd do this sometimes with people he actually wanted to continue to be in his company, but he just kind of wanted to break their spirits. Well, you know, brilliant man, but he left all kinds of bodies in the wake. And it's not just CEOs that this happens with. It happens with toddlers. Have you ever seen kids play? There's a bunch of toys in the room. They're not interested in that toy over there until another kid's interested in that toy over there, and then that's the one that they have to have. You know, so we see this in elementary school and middle school and high school, and you hear all this talk about bullying that is going on. It has a lot to do with calling shotgun, trying to establish, who is the greatest. We've obviously seen a lot of this in the early stages of the presidential election process. Shotgun. 3 times the disciples argued over who was the greatest. The very disciples who had watched Jesus minister to the last, the least, and the lost. The very disciples who had seen Jesus have dinner, associate with those that everybody else saw as outcasts. The very disciples who watched Jesus touch those who were considered to be the untouchable. And yet, they're the ones who were wanting to be top dog, calling shotgun. And Jesus says, you gotta be kidding me. One of the times he takes a little child out and says, and if you want to be great, you got to be like one of these children, humble, not assuming things, and trusting. In case you've missed it, greatness is about serving. And in the Gospel of John, we see that they're still arguing about greatness even at the Last Supper. As they are gathered around the Last Supper, they're arguing about greatness, and Jesus gets up from the table, he puts a towel around his waist, and then he bends down and begins to wash the feet of the disciples, doing the very task that is the lowest of low jobs, the job of the servants. This man who could do everything, who could heal, who could calm the storms, who could raise somebody from the dead, this man washed the disciples' feet, and he calls us to have that same servant attitude. I get called upon to do a good number of memorial services. Unfortunately, a number of them are from the people in our congregation, but sometimes they're from people in the community that just don't have a church association. And in doing those memorial services, I often feel like I'm given the job of measuring a person's life. What's their life all about? And there are a lot of ways that people in our culture measure greatness, but the most important measure of greatness is through the eyes of Jesus. And if you want to be great in the eyes of Jesus, you need to be a servant of others. If you want to be great, then volunteer on Service Sunday. Be a servant. If you want to be great, be a Sunday school teacher. We're currently praying and looking for a new kindergarten teacher. Be a servant. If you want to be great, serve on one of our ministry teams. Be a servant. If you want to be great, shovel your neighbor's yard or mow your neighbor's yard. Be a servant. If you want to be great, visit a lonely person, a person in a nursing home. Be a servant. If you want to be great, buy a bag of groceries and take it to the doorstep of someone who's lost their job. Be a servant. If you want to be great, take a visitor out to lunch after church. Be a servant. If you want to be great, look over the faults of someone else and look for something good in their lives and something nice to say about them. Be a servant. If you want to be great, support the leadership of this church and pray for them. Be a servant. If you want to be great, help provide transportation for people to church or to doctors, or for people who aren't able to drive anymore. Be a servant. If you want to be great, start tithing. Be a servant. If you want to be great, invite a non-Christian over to your house for dinner and then invite them to church with you. Be a servant. If you want to be great, volunteer the next time that we have Salem Interfaith Hospitality Network here. Be a servant. I could just go on for probably an hour with examples of ways that you could be great. But if you want to be great, you got to be a servant. You can help me with the Satans. If you want to be great, what? You got it. Say it with a little more enthusiasm this time. If you want to be great, be a servant. One more time. If you want to be great, be a servant. Awesome. Let's pray.